Hello everyone and welcome. Today I wanted to go over a few deck lists that I was using in the ranked season, December 2022, on the standard arena ladder in order to hit Mythic, to go over my statistics as well. So I use MTGA Assistant. Of course, you can use whatever third-party software you'd like or keep track of it yourself, but MTGA Assistant really is a wonderful way to keep track of that, and I'll be using those statistics today. Not affiliated with MTGA Assistant at all. It's just what I happen to use as of right now. So let me go ahead and pull up my statistics, and then I will also pull up my decks here as well, so that way I can go over some of the actual numbers with you as we go through the decks here. I wanted to present 5 deck lists that are going to be your best option, trying to either seal up Mythic for the end of this season. There's still a few days to do that. Alternatively, you may get a quick start on the next season and get that Mythic snagged very quickly, and not waste your time on subpar lists. Okay, so it should be said that a lot of this requires some flexibility. So I played all of the decks that you see on your screen. These are all of the lists that I played to get Mythic. I played between 20 to 30 games of each of them. Some of them I played more than others, however, but on average, I at least played that many with all of these decks. I was able to get a 50% win rate or above with most of them, except for a few of the notable exceptions that we'll have at the end of the video. So coming in at number 5 for me is going to be mono red. Okay. Of course, people on the ranked ladder love their mono red lists. Out of everything, I found mono red to be the least competitive, but also the quickest. You either won or lost quite quickly. And that can have an advantage, of course, whenever you're trying to climb. There are 2 versions of mono red that I played. Both have their merits. However, the deck I had the highest win rate with was actually, I just calling it haste red because all of the creatures have haste. It's 3-drop heavy as well. However, this is the list that I was able to play 32 games of with a 68%, which is a great sample size and a great win rate overall. So again, I started from bronze. I went to mythic in about 2 days time. I did not play any ranked at all for the past few months. I did not play any ranked at the beginning of this season. I just started a few days ago, and I played about 7 to 8 hours total, and I was able to achieve mythic with these decks. I thought now was a great time to get into Magic and maybe even go to a few tournaments, and I decided to brush up on Arena. So let's take a look at the mono red list here. Okay, so notice how the deck is very heavy on both 1-drops and 3-drops. So we play 6 3-drops, and we also have a full play set of the Raiju at 4. For that reason, because this deck is a little top heavy for mono red, we play 23 lands. And I also want to point out that we are not playing any Mishra's Foundry. So the reason we're not playing any Mishra's is simply because it is incredibly important to be able to double spell on turn 2. And since we play a plethora of 1-drops, that comes up quite often. So with these low aggressive lists, you want to be able to double spell as quickly as possible. That's your advantage, is getting to your late game quicker than other decks. And whenever you are essentially choked on mana because you have an awkward Mishra's Foundry in your opening hand, you better hope that turn 2 you have a creature to play. So we have 4 bloodthirsty adversaries in this list because we do play 8 burn spells. That comes up quite often, that you get the counter on Bloodthirsty Adversary, especially with 23 lands. It's definitely possible. So why do I like this list over the Mechanized Warfare lists at 3 mana? I found that this list is very versatile in that it applies pressure against everything. You can't wipe the board within the festivities like you can in the Mechanized Warfare lists. However, this deck is more versatile against a wider variety of lists, so I had a much easier time winning games against both control and against decks, mid-range decks like mono black and mono white life gain, using this list here, because every single turn you're playing a haste threat and applying more pressure, and it also kills your control opponents more quickly. So this is the list that I would recommend playing for mono red. However, if you are running into a lot of soldiers on the ladder, mono white or Azorius soldiers, or even mono green, which I have not seen in a while, or green white enchantments, if you're running into those decks, you may want to consider moving on to the alternative mono red list here. This mono red list is actually a mini control deck. Your objective is to essentially play the control game against other creature decks. And you do that because of In the Festivities. This is essentially a board wipe against other creature decks. And if you have a mechanized warfare on the board, it's very easy to wipe boards a lot of the time. There's actually really fun interactions that I've had against mono white soldiers where they play the Valiant Veteran, the 2/2 Lord that pumps the other soldiers. You kill them, and because their other stuff were pumped 3/3s, they end up dying as well because they lose the +1/+1 from the veteran. So this list has its upsides in that you're better against other small creature decks. However, if you find that you're facing against mono white life gain, mono black, Grixis control, things like that, you want to go with the haste version of mono red. If you find yourself playing up against the soldier lists and other small creature decks, you may want to try this list of mono red as well. It's very board heavy. It's a dirtily version of mono red, okay? So you get to play a full playset of Reckless Impulse. You get to draw a lot of cards. We have Chandra Dress to Kill in the deck as well. We have 2 Feldon instead of the 1 in the other list, so you're able to really cycle through cards. We have the 4 blood tokens from the Voldaren Epicure. So you get to draw a lot of cards in this red list, which is uncharacteristic of these types of builds. And you also get to wipe your opponent's board, which is also normally uncharacteristic of mono red. So this is a unique time to play mono red, I think. And if you are playing up against a lot of soldiers on the ladder, which you may at the end of a season, because aggressive lists will be more popular, this may be the list that you wish to choose. Okay, so if mono red is not your thing, that's perfectly fine because I think there are actually stronger decks. And we will go ahead and move forward then. So next is going to be mono blue tempo. So at number 4, I'm going to recommend mono blue tempo. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the list here. So this list, or this deck rather, has the upside of being one of the cheaper options. So if you want a competitive deck to play in Arena, but you're not fortunate enough to be able to play multiple decks, then this may be what you go to. So this deck here plays a lot like a Delver list. In fact, a lot of the lists that I'm running into on the ladder are playing Delver of Secrets. I don't think the Delver is all that great in Standard right now. However, it's definitely possible to play that list. So this is the list that I've settled on for now as being one of the better ones. So what's the deck all about? You play a tempo game. You play on your opponent's turn the vast majority of the time. Eventually in the game, you will either resolve a Djinn, which is an absurd card, or a Tolarian Terror, which is also an absurd card. It's kind of like Delve, but you don't have to actually delve anything. So it's very good. If you really enjoyed playing Delver lists in Modern, or maybe some of the Pyromancer lists, Jund Pyromancer, Grixis Pyromancer, things like that from the Modern era, this might be something that a type of list that you would like to play. So you draw a lot of cards, you cycle through a lot of cards, you reduce the cost of your spells, and you win with a large threat while holding up counter magic. So if that's the game you like to play, the tempo game, then this deck may be for you. So you're not that great into mono red, although mono red can have a lot of issue. If you're able to resolve a Tolarian Terror and you have a fairly high life total, 8, 9, 10 or higher, then a Tolarian Terror will probably win the game because mono red cannot remove this card. They either have to double spell, which is impossible for the Ward 2 mechanic, or they would need to have a Mechanized Warfare on the board and play a 3 mana Obliterating Bolt, which would deal 4 damage plus 1, 5. Alternatively, they can play Rending Flame, which is 3 mana to deal 5 damage. So they would need 5 mana to Rending Flame this, which most lists aren't even playing Rending Flame in the main deck. If you're playing Best of One Ladder, you're not going to see that card. And on top of that, mono red would never be able to cast it at 5 mana. So if you are at a stable life total and you resolve a Tolarian Terror, you are most likely winning the game. However, the Jin is going to be how you win most of your games, simply through the mana advantage that it generates every turn. So you're fortunate if this can generate 1 mana for you a turn, but if this is generating, 1, 2, 3 mana per turn and on your opponent's turn, possibly, then this card is going to be insane, and that's really how you win. That's what you're looking to do, is safely resolve one of these, ideally with counter magic backup, and you just play the game from there and continue drawing more cards. So this is the list. Plays in Odawara. You can play 2 of these if you want to. Go down an island and go up in Odawara. I am perfectly fine with that. If you don't have the rare wild card, or you don't have a second one of these, you don't need it. You can even skip not playing this at all. Although if you do have access to these, I do highly recommend playing at least 1, maybe 2. Okay, so let's go ahead then and take a look at 2 of the spell options here. I want to note that I'm running 1 Essence Scatter and 1 Negate. So the reason I'm doing that, and 2 of the 3 mana counterspell here, I do have Syncopates, which are kind of a catch-all. However, I am playing 1 of each because the Essence Scatter is having game against everything. So even control decks are playing creatures. There's never a time where Essence Scatter or Negate are not going to be very good. Against mono red, Essence Scatter might not be the best if you're trading a 2 mana spell for a 1 mana threat. However, mono red lists, as we just saw, are very 3-drop heavy these days. They play Squeeze, they play the Storm Seekers, so you can get a lot of mana value out of an Essence Scatter as compared to a 3 mana counterspell. Negate is the same thing. It's not dead against mono red. You can counter lightning strikes, you can counter Chandras, and of course against control lists that you run into, the negate is going to be very powerful as well. So that's why I like that choice as of right now. The make disappear is just insane early game. However, this is the list I've settled on. Now you're going to be weak against Grixis control. You do run into that list on the ladder, although it's unlikely in best of ones. You're not that great into mono red, because if you tap out turn 3 for a Jin to try to block their creatures, they'll hit it with Obliterating Bolt, and then you'll probably lose the game from there. So with that being said, you may not have the best matchup into mono red, but into slightly slower decks like Soldiers, you have a lot of game, and I think you're very favored. I also think you're favored into mono black. However, it should be noted that you can have a hard time if they play Liliana. So especially if they're on the draw. So if you play your Jin on turn 3, and then they untap and they play a Liliana on their turn 3 or something like that, that can be very difficult to beat. In fact, you probably lose that game. So if you tap out, play Jin on turn 3, they untap, play Liliana, minus, you sacrifice Jin, and now they're going, that Liliana's on the board for the most part the rest of the game, and they're going to be eating away at your card advantage in your hand, which is going to be very difficult to beat. So as long as you do not succumb to the Liliana sacrificing on your Jin, you should be fine. Happened to me a few times, lesson learned. You learn from it and move on. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next deck then. So coming in at number 3 is going to be Mono White Life Gain. So I think Mono White Life Gain is the 3rd best deck that you could possibly be playing. Of course, you practically have guaranteed wins against mono red. So if you are playing up against a lot of mono red, highly recommend this deck. You will destroy them no matter what. Even hands I drew poorly, I just never had a problem with the deck. You just have so much innate life gain that overpower them eventually. Something you play will stick and win the game. And you also have access to 2 Wandering Emperors in here, which mono red has a very hard time beating as well. I know it sounds strange to have 8 Pain Lands in the list because they deal damage to you and you're mono white. Why do you need for the Archangel of Wrath? So you want to kick this card. You can always use them for colorless mana. However, whenever you kick this card, keep in mind that you're still netting 1 life because Archangel has lifelink, dealing the 2 damage. So you will gain that that 2 life if you are able to kick the card. So you're netting 1 life if you have to use the Pain Land. So they're not that bad. They are worth it because this can remove substantial amount of creatures in both Soldiers and mono white, or sorry, and mono red. So you'll win practically 90% of the time against mono red. I'm rocking about, let me check my statistics. I'm currently pushing 60% winner this deck, close to 30 games. Most of those were mono red and soldiers. However, once I started playing up against Grixis Control, I was losing a lot. Obviously, Grixis Control has a very good matchup into this. I was also losing a fair amount of games to mono blue. Um, just not that much life gain deck for that to really be justified because mono blue is hitting you for large chunks with Tolarian Terror and Jin. So it can be difficult, although you have lay down arms, which is standard sword to plowshares. It's very good. And you can oftentimes remove their threats, but it can be very difficult. So you just play standard combo cards with life gain, Voice of the Blessed, the Inspiring Overseer, gain a life, draw a card, play the some number of the Giadas. That way, when you play your angels, still Seraph is an angel, notably. These will come out with counters on them, and they'll be almost impossible to stop with a lot of creature decks. So something will stick eventually. So this is a great list if you're seeing a lot of mono red on the ladder. However, if you're facing a lot of control or mono blue lists, then maybe you want to opt for something else. But overall in power level, this deck proved to be pretty versatile, and I enjoyed playing it. Okay, so let's go ahead then and forward. The second best list that I will recommend, or the second best archetype, is going to be mono black. The mono black proved to be easily the most versatile deck of everything that I played. You can, in the middle of a match, swap up how you play. If you play more controlling or you need to play aggressive, you can make that decision, and this deck allows you the flexibility to make those kinds of changes. It was actually really phenomenal to see that type of deck. Mono black has been like that in the past. If we look at in Theros era standard, mono black mid range with Desecration Demon and Thoughtseize and that crazy stuff was actually played out in really similar ways as this deck is playing out right now. We don't have Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Instead, at 5 mana, we have Invoke Despair as like the big hitter. This card is very insane, although sometimes it can be a dead card. We get to play Liliana of the Veil, which is extraordinarily good, but the deck is just so powerful because Shieldred is a monster, and you have so much excellent one-for-one removal. You have recurring card draw and aggressive damage with Dog. You have Evolve Sleeper, with draws you cards as well. This is like the new Undercity um, connections from back in the day from the Devotion builds. This card is really good. So it has a lot of innate card draw built in. I would like to mention that you have a few flex slots in this deck. So some people are opting for a one of I think the card is pretty good. Every time I've drawn it, I've been happy with it. However, if you have this in your opening hand and they play a turn 1 Kumano or a turn 1 Swift Spear, you won't feel very good. So it's kind of just a dead card in that matchup. Although it can be your finisher if you transition to a controlling playstyle and you have enough 1-for-1 removal and small creatures to match mono red. But if you feel like you're facing a lot of mono red on the ladder, you can take out that and maybe add in another cut down. You can also swap out Cruelty of Gix for Okiba Reckoner Raid, which is the 1 mana saga that gains you life and turns into a 2/2 with Menace. So you have a lot of options here. Cruelty of Gix, though, is proven to be very flexible. It's really good against mid-range and control decks both. This card is awesome. Losing 3 life is not great against mono red, so sometimes you want to just opt to move straight to the third option on this. Okay, so mono red tends to have a really rough time against mono black. Mono white life gain, I noticed that these matchups were basically 50-50. I had a fair amount of play into best of one control decks, even though I was playing a ton of removal. They also play a fair amount of creatures, and having a cut down for something like their goblin from the 3 mana enchantment that gives you goblins and lets you draw cards. Having cut down for the goblin is very good, or even just the 2/2 Kiki Jiki that comes of it. So if they do play the Kiki Jiki enchantment, then cut down is not even dead. So you're going to be able to hit a lot of creatures from those types of decks. They have Corpse Appraiser and those mid-range control lists. Just a lot of good options from mono black here. It's so flexible. So if you really want just a flexible, no nonsense deck, this would be my recommendation for you. I have it at the second strongest. Okay, let's go ahead and move on then to the number 1 strongest list. So mono black, I had a 58% win rate out of 30 games. Very respectable. However, it's nothing even comparable to mono white soldiers. My number 1 list is going to be mono white soldiers. I have a 79% win rate out of 39 games. So out of 40 games, a 79% with this list, this exact list. It has proven to be absolutely absurd. So ordinarily, mono white is not really my kind of playstyle, but this deck offers a lot of flexibility. Surprisingly, for an aggro deck, you would think, oh, I'm creature based, I'm bad against control, or like mono black mid range builds that have a ton of removal. Not true. You have Recruitment Officer and Yorian Frontliner, sorry, Yodian Frontliner, Yoshin Frontliner. You have the one drop, so you're competitive with mono red in terms of pressure. So you have aggressive creatures you can play against control, and you have Thalia, which is also great against control. You're playing legacy staples in standard. This is like a pseudo Swords to Plowshare. You have access to a lot of really powerful cards. Mono red, of course, has a massive issue with this card as well. So this card is good against the mono blue decks, the Grixis decks, the mono red decks, even the mirror match. Like if they have to pay 2 mana for a lay down arms to get rid of this, you've kind of won. Um, and Guardian of New Benalia, this card has proven to be insanely absurd. Mono red can't attack through it. Grixis control can't destroy it. Mono blue can bounce it back to your hand, but who cares? You just play it, and they have to counter it. They use 2 cards. They 2-for-1 themselves. So this card's insanely good. Can't tell you the amount of times that people do have to 2-for-1 themselves. Mono red has to burn it in response to you activating its ability. You don't have any cards left to discard. That came up one time. You win games by unearthing your frontliner here. Insanely good. Because you don't have to double spell on turn 1, you can actually play the Mishra's Foundry, so you have access to creature lands. You can play Wandering Emperor. All of your cards just work together so phenomenally well. You have so much graveyard play. You have options to look at your library here, pay 4 mana, and get a card into your hand. So you have aggression, you have resiliency, you have removal, you have card draw, you have creature lands. And on top of that, you also interact with your opponents by not letting them cast spells on your turn when you play Myral. This card is insane. It also doubles the amount of creatures that you have on the board most of the time. And your creatures are also removal spells. This deck has proven to just be absurd. Even your lands remove stuff. It's crazy. So you're good at, you'd think this deck is bad against control decks, but it's not because they have a hard time with your aggressive threats. You have some very slippery 2-drops that control can't deal with. Even if they are able to remove your stuff, you have a fair amount of graveyard interaction with your aggressive creatures here and your Valiant Veteran giving stuff counters, things like that. Also play Planeswalkers. You could go up another Wandering Emperor if you wanted to. I'm not sure what you would cut. Maybe a second, or maybe cut the third Laydown Arms to go to a second Wandering Emperor. This card is great against mid-range, great against aggro, and great against control. This deck has quite literally everything you want, and that shows in my results. Playing this with close to an 80% win rate out of 40 games. Deck is nuts. This is what I would recommend to you at this moment in time, especially if you're playing up against a lot of mid-range. This deck just crushes mid-range because you set up a massive board and you're able to remove their big threat that they use to stabilize, like Sheoldred, for example, or Mono White Life Gain. They play the Steel Seraph, and come in with a Brutal Cathar and just exile it, or you play Borrowed Time. Mono Red plays its 3 mana Mechanized Warfare. You play your 3 mana Borrowed Time and exile it. This hits Planeswalkers. This deck is really, really absurd. Very powerful. So that's my number 1 list. That's what I recommend you play right now for the absolute best results. Sometimes you can get hit with a board sweeper in some of the combo decks. So they play the Brothers War. I think that's what it's called. It's the pseudo Anger of the Gods, the red 3 mana, deal 3 damage. That can be a little bit of a beating. They have also Depopulate, 4 mana board wipe. The Populate can also be a bit of a beating. But if you play around board wipes correctly, you don't have to worry about it. And at the day, you have Guardian of New Benalia that you can just give indestructible, and you have Thalia, which makes them cost more. So I'm not too worried about board wipes whenever I'm playing this list. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to 2 notable decks. The first one is it. So I played is it about 20 games with a 45% based on my statistics here. I don't think the deck's that great, but maybe I wasn't playing this deck very well either. So it's very much it's similar to mono blue, so it is a tempo list, but you do play red, which gives you access to removal, and also Fable of the Mirror Breaker. So you get the Kiki Jiki card, just nuts, right? This card is insane. And you get to do some fun stuff with this deck, and you also basically have your own Pyromancer here. You have Third Path Iconoclast, um, which, like I said, this card essentially is Pyromancer. It's just slightly harder to cast, being blue red. But that's how you win the game. You also play the Jin, which is an insanely good card. You have some flex slots here. Right now, this is playing a Disciple of Drowned. You can swap this out for essentially whatever you wanted. More removal would probably be my guess. But you're essentially trying to win the game through a Delver type playstyle. You can even maybe play some Delvers in the list, but I don't think they're necessary. So this deck, I wasn't able to play it with much success. However, if you're a better blue player than I am, then maybe you could make this deck work. It's very fun to play. And if this is your playstyle, it might be worth giving it a try. You could probably squeak this closer to 50% masterful playstyle. All right, and the deck that is in my wheelhouse, I played green red or Gruul, and on the surface, I thought this list was going to be insane. I saw it a few times online, and I thought it looks a lot of fun. I'm going to try it. Most of my success in Magic has come from these green red monster lists or Jund monster lists, especially, Theros era. Like I top eighted so many events with Jund monsters, insane, or green red monsters whenever uh, Theros rotation happened. So you play a lot of the haste one drops. You have not quite a mana dork, but you have Stalwart, which does ramp you if you have another creature. You play a lot of haste threats. You have graveyard interaction, a lot of counters here. Beast Caller and the Halana, Thundering Raiju. However, the deck just could not get there for me. I played this about 20 games with a 35% win rate. I found that I was losing to mono red a lot. So I'm just not big enough, right? Like to beat mono red, you want to be just a little bit bigger, right? So this deck isn't a little bit bigger. You're paying 4 mana for a 2/3. Yeah, it gives a counter, which is, I think this is a strong legendary creature. Um, but it's just too slow. And so you're too slow for the control decks, and you're not big enough to beat the mono red decks, if that makes sense. So I found it just did not have very much good interaction. There's so much exile in the format right now, so this would just get lay down arms every time from the mono white lists. I don't get to put my counters around, or Brutal Cathar or something like that, so your counters go nowhere. Because Beast Caller's not dying, it's becoming exiled. So I just was not able to string together wins with this list. Did not work for me, but maybe you want to give it a shot and see. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching. I hope you made it to the end of the video. These are all of the decks that I recommend. Well, the 5 decks that I recommend. Is it maybe if you're good at blue? I do not recommend playing Gruul at all. Just to recap, mono blue tempo, mono red, mono white life gain, mono black, mono white soldiers. Now, if you want to play Azorius soldiers instead of mono white, you can do that. However, you'll be slightly slower and less consistent, so you'll be worse against the control decks. However, soldiers is still an incredibly powerful variant, whether you play the Azorius or the mono white version. Entirely up to you based on what you're seeing on the ladder. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.